This photo was taken in Kabul, Afghanistan, in September of 2002, exactly 1 year after the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center. The man who took this photo was not a soldier. He wasn't a journalist. He was just a 24-year-old man from Phoenix, Arizona, traveling with a small NGO, trying to figure out what was real. His name is Philip Buckley, and he's my father.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices, secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror.
On September 11th, nearly 3,000 people were killed in coordinated terrorist attacks on New York and Washington. 7 days later, Congress passed a 60-word sentence, the Authorization for the Use of Military Force, or AMUF, authorizing the president to use all necessary and appropriate force against anyone connected to the attacks. According to the Radiolab podcast, 60 Words, almost no one who voted for it fully understood how broadly it would be eventually be applied. Only one member of Congress voted against it, warning it was dangerously open-ended.
September 11th changed the world. Our deepest fears now haunt us. Yet I am convinced that military action will not prevent further acts of international terrorism against the United States.
The invasion of Afghanistan followed weeks later. The Taliban collapsed quickly, and back home, public support was nearly unanimous. Americans were united, grieving and certain that they were on the right side. My dad was one of those Americans.
There was a lot of, I would feel like in those years for me, there was just a lot of belief that that our country was always doing the right thing with the right motives. And when we were attacked on 9/11, it was very clear that there was like an enemy that didn't like us and was after us.
He traveled to Kabul in September of 2002 with a small faith-based NGO, doing food distributions and construction work. He went as a believer. What he found complicated everything. Anti-American sentiment. The first story America told itself after 9/11 was about the enemy. Afghans, and by extension people from the broader Middle East, were dangerous. They hated Americans. The attacks were proof of this hate. The concepts of hate, terrorism, and fear was constantly linked by the George W. Bush administration with the Middle East and Afghanistan to further maintain support and American belief that Americans were doing the right thing throughout the military action in Afghanistan and the eventual war on terror that continued. Researchers Gershinoff and Kushner analyzed 13 speeches from September 2002 to May of 2003. 12 of these referenced terror in Iraq in the same paragraph, and 10 of them placed in the same sentence. My dad landed in Kabul with these feelings and information in his head. He read Pakistani newspapers that portrayed America as a colonizer, and he took that very seriously. But people in front of him told him a different story.
I never met anybody that told me that they hated Americans. And I never really had people yell at me or anything like that. And
The problems with aid NGOs in Afghanistan were numerous. The second large story that America told itself was about this idea of generosity, that America wasn't just fighting Afghanistan for peace, we were helping them. NGOs were on the ground distributing food and supplies, helping to rebuild a country that had just been ravaged by war. Aid was flowing to the people who needed it. My dad went on these distributions.
But what would happen was we would leave right after the distribution, and it was always kind of like a hurrah moment. But I realized, like, we actually don't know what happens to the oil. We don't know what happens to all the flour and the blankets, and if this stuff is all really used or if it's gathered up again.
Scholar Laura Olson studied NGO operations in Afghanistan during this period. She found that over 800 international Afghan NGOs were operating alongside the US military forces, and that the US was deliberately using humanitarian aid as a tool to win hearts and minds, gather intelligence, and ease the acceptance of foreign troops. Aid and militarism mission had merged, and in areas controlled by warlords, which was most of Afghanistan, accountability was nearly impossible.
Kind of disillusion that, like, when you go to some place and you think you're this great person, like the story of America, that, you know, here we are, we're thinking we're rebuilding this country. They're going to thank us, and we're going to build schools, and we're going to give education to their women, and all these great things are going to come through this. But we're not really we're not really there for the right motives, or our intentions are not always good, and we don't really always hang around later to find out what really happens.
While I'm sure my father's NGO was not involved in the American military in the same way as many of the other NGOs, the point is, it's similar to these speeches being used to control the narrative of the Middle East towards the Americans. NGOs were also used by the American government to tell a story about Afghanistan. So why does my father's story matter? We already have information about how public opinion was manufactured, and we already have information about the structural failure of humanitarian aid. We already have information about the legality. So where does his story fit in? This perspective of an actual American who grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, and grew up with these sentiments that were mostly targeted towards white Christians at the time, and his experience of visiting Afghanistan, seeing how his feelings and his understanding of Afghanistan was actually incorrect, is key to understanding American disillusionment at the time.